This is 8 Minutes, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. Back in October, California passed a really important bill. Officially titled Senate Bill 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, it's often shortened and simplified to just SB 253. And what SB 253 does is, for the first time, require large companies operating in California to report on the greenhouse gas emissions that their companies are creating. It's creating transparency and consistency so that stakeholders can understand the real impact of a company's operations on climate. That bill was spearheaded by a nonprofit in California called Carbon Accountable, who took the bill to State Senator Scott Wiener and worked with the senator to successfully get this first-of-a-kind legislation across the finish line. Today, I'm joined by the co-founder of Carbon Accountable and one of the chief architects of SB 253, Catherine Atkin. I'm looking forward to unpacking this new legislation with her over the next few minutes. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's rays to hit Earth, or about 7 minutes longer than my kids will spend on the phone with their grandparents during the holidays. It's not just my kids, right? Let's get it on. Catherine Atkin, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
I am very excited to dig into this. What you have accomplished out in California is remarkable, and I can't wait to learn more and share it with our audience. But why don't we start with an introduction as to who you are, what Carbon Accountable is, and maybe start in that direction first.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, so Catherine Atkin, and I'm an attorney that has a long history in sort of systems change work. I was in ed tech. And it's actually a great story for all of us who are thinking about, like, how do we make a difference in climate? And then about 6 years ago, I decided that, my next big turn of the professional wheel was to try to add and be of service to this, monumental challenge we all have to ensure a 1.5 degree future for ourselves and our children. So I had a chance to really roll up my sleeves and think about where we were as an attorney in developing the policy and regulating environment that would drive down carbon emissions. And so had a chance to look at, like, where had we come and where do we need to go? And looking at where we were and where we need to go, the fact of the matter is that we just didn't have the GHG data we needed to be smart about making decisions about climate action and where to put resources to decarbonize, and that we really needed mandatory reporting by corporations in order to give ourselves and those corporations the data they needed to move down the road more quickly. So it was great to be in a democracy where you can develop a policy proposal and go to Sacramento and have a legislator take a bill and have it become law. So it's been really gratifying to be part of this, what has become a much larger movement.
I hadn't realized that you'd started in ed tech, and you've been doing this for 6 years. I've been doing this for 20 years, and you're making me feel very unproductive right now, just so you know.
No, you know what it is? It's sort of like, as life goes on and you kind of, you get into something and you're a newbie, you just kind of are, in some ways, just sort of, you can afford to just go, well, wait a second, I'm just going to try this because I haven't done a lot of other things when it comes to climate. So I actually just think I was also right place, right time. I'm really privileged to live in California. We have such an amazing legacy of climate and environmental laws and, groundbreaking, first of its kind policy reform. So also just knowing we've done the low carbon fuel standards and cap and trade and toxics laws. And so we just, it's really building on that whole body of work that California has led on historically.
Well, so I think that's a fascinating segue into, the breadth and scope of California's leadership onto this. But I want to, maybe before we get to that point, talk a little bit more specifically about SB 253. Let's ground our audience in terms of what this is, what it means, why it's so important. And frankly, Catherine, I'd love to understand a little bit more about your role in terms of bringing this to fruition too.
Okay, well, basics, sort of GHG accounting 101. Right now, as you know, I mean, we're in a sort of global state of CO2 emissions being much greater than they can be for us to ensure this like 1.5 sustainable future. So
Mhm.
we have these GHG emissions, and we're creating more and more of them. And so it's really important. GHG accounting is the beauty. Sort of the bad news is we've got all these molecules out there. The good news is we can count them. And that's a very powerful driver of change that we have with us and on our side when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. So we can measure those GHG emissions, and we can create an environment that both promotes the reduction of those emissions and supports those that are doing that work most quickly. So when it comes to the corporations and their GHG emissions, up to now, and SB 253 is not the only thing happening. We have major changes in the EU and globally. We recognize is that voluntary emissions reporting, which is what some of the leading companies are already been doing, right? They've been saying, we know GHG emissions reductions are important. We need to measure them. And we're also going to disclose them. So we have some that are just measuring but not disclosing, some that are disclosing. But it's really a patchwork quilt right now of emissions, what companies decide to disclose along their supply chain in addition to their operations. So SB 253 just says, look, let's all start comparing apples to apples. Let's all disclose according to the leading global standard in the same way so that we can start making sense of where we are and where we need to go.
I think you said a couple of things that were really interesting there. One of which is just trying to maximize or trying to standardize around one way of reporting. So part of the genesis of this particular episode is that I sat in on a panel that Catherine was part of at a Verge conference, a climate tech conference out in San Jose, California, just a few weeks ago. And one of the things that they said was, we have financial standards on reporting. We have accounting standards that we hold ourselves to so that we're all looking at the same information when we try to compare one company against another company around their financial health, right? And what you're proposing through SB 253 and what's regulated now and legislated through SB 253 is really doing the same thing around their climate emissions, through their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's really intriguing because up until this point, and this is the second point that you brought up, though I reversed them in the order that you talked about them, is up until this point, it's all been very voluntary. It's either been through the CDP, which was formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. It's been through, the Science-Based Target Initiative, or through, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is managed by the World Resources Institute and a couple of other large organizations out there that are working with corporations to voluntarily take action. What's interesting about the California bill is that now it's a requirement. Can you talk a little bit about how that came to be?
Yeah, yes. And I would say, this move from voluntary to mandatory in so many things that, there's an arc for new innovations and new best practices. And so, voluntary emissions reporting had its time, right? We needed to figure out how to do it. I mean, how does GHG accounting work? How do corporations incorporate that, as you said, into their internal processes? How do we use these standards and also develop technologies to support the deployment and both the accounting and the reporting? And so, that happened, and it was an important decade or two process. But we have now gotten to the point where we sort of gotten to the limit of the efficacy of voluntary reporting because we now needed to use it for a much more comprehensive effort to decarbonize, right? We had the Paris Agreement in 2015. We had these nationally determined contributions. And as we've seen, we're just not making the progress that's required to create the future that we need and our children need. So really, it's more like we weren't seeing those things, the sort of decline in emissions. We were learning how to do voluntary, but it wasn't serving our purposes. So at a certain point, we needed to just put in a standard and say, now it's mandatory attendance at school, right? Like you got to go and we got to get the right information so that you can be smarter and that we can be smarter too. So really mandatory emissions reporting. And as you said, we have financial reporting. And what we said is that carbon emissions are like, financial data. Exactly. It is core data to a company, and it's part of their future sustainability is how they're managing their climate risk. And it has to be, and the impacts that they're having on climate have to be built into their business model.
and more stakeholders, whether they're investors or consumers or state and policymakers, whatever it might be, are looking for some sort of information around how a company is thinking about their impact as well as their resilience to climate change, right?
Exactly.
So let's put a wrapper a little bit around what SB 253 is, all right? And I'm going to ask a few logistical questions.
Mhm.
Who is affected by this new legislation?
So this GHG corporate disclosure requirement in California will apply to any U.S. company that has more than $1 billion in revenue that does business in California. So
they don't need to be headquartered in California, just as long as they do business in California.
exactly. I mean, and part of the rationale for that policy approach is that, as we know, California can't protect its residents by just reducing its own carbon footprint, right? GHG molecules like don't know any boundaries. So really, to protect Californians, California needs to take action to reduce global emissions and to create an environment where corporations are being smart about their activities. And also recognizing that if a corporation wants to do business in California to benefit from the largesse of the California economy, then they ought to be disclosing in the same way they do their financial accounting, their GHG emissions. So if you're a US company and have revenue of more than $1 billion, which our estimates are about 5,400 companies nationally will be subject to this new requirement, and you do business in California, you're going to need to report beginning in 2026.
Both public and private companies?
Thank you for that softball. Yes. And that's one of the things that actually is, well, we can talk a little bit about the federal SEC has a proposed rule around climate risk that would apply to publicly traded companies. We're still waiting for that final rule. We see it as a both and approach to this, but that SEC rule would not apply to private companies. And we really felt like it was so important for the privates to get involved too, because in a lot of ways, they are probably the least likely to be disclosing right now. If you're, it's really those publicly traded corporations where we're seeing kind of greater traction around reporting. So also, frankly, to create an even playing field, because if you're going to ask publicly traded companies to disclose, it's not really fair that their brethren that are privately held aren't having to do the same thing. So for those reasons, public and private, definitely.
So I am going to come back to some of the challenges around this. As you said, you're asking companies that aren't even headquartered in California to report on this. I definitely want to come back to that. I definitely want to come back to you sort of teed up this idea of the SEC and some of the activities that are going on there. But the last question I have around the very specifics around SB 253 is when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, what does SB 253 cover? There's scope 1, which is really the direct emissions that a company creates during their operations, right? Whether it's, sitting in an office building and the emissions created because of the energy used in the office building, whether it's the energy used for a steel manufacturer or something like that, right? There's scope 2, which is, anything that you purchase from an electric utility or an entity like that. And then there's scope 3, which is really the supply chain as well as the consumer handprint around the emissions. How deep down that rabbit hole does SB 253 go?
So SB 253 adopts the globally recognized GHG protocol standard, and that standard defines, as you said, scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and those scope 3 emissions are those supply chain emissions, those upstream and downstream elements that a company doesn't directly control, but which are part of the goods that they may purchase to make a product, or the downstream use of their product, including things like business travel and transportation. And the importance of scope 3 being included is because on average, it's about 90% of a company's carbon footprint. So if a corporation's only disclosing scopes 1 and 2, we're not really understanding their full carbon footprint, and they're not really leveraging their corporate leadership to help decarbonize that supply chain. So SB 253 puts in place a very rigorous standard of disclosure around those three scopes.
All right, so that's what SB 253 is. It covers off on large corporations, both public and private. It forces them to, or requires them to report upon all their greenhouse gas emissions, even down into the supply chain. Certain challenges associated with this, but you mentioned earlier about some of the upcoming regulations that the SEC is thinking about putting in place. Certainly, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, just put in place some guidelines associated with the International Financial Reporting Standards. I know I'm getting into
Wow. No,
alphabet
you're good.
of stuff here, but as we think about some of these converging standards globally that are focused on carbon disclosure, and how SB 253 fits into that global mix, and California's role in terms of like trying to get out in front of this. I can say a lot of acronyms, okay, but you're going to have to explain to me exactly what's happening in this global context.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually in the 3 years, like going from when we first approached Senator Wiener to carry this bill, and it got signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom in October. We've seen a lot of activity in this emerging global landscape, which I think really put wind in our sails in California, which is we really see a sort of tipping point on mandatory corporate GHG emissions requirements. You're seeing globally some of those, SB 253 is about GHG emissions disclosure. That's sort of a subset of a larger disclosure regime around climate risk. And then some of these entities, like in the EU, you're getting this broader ESG, right? The environment, social, and governance, standards and requirements. But really, when it comes to GHG emissions disclosure, as you said, we have the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU. We've got this ISSB standard that other countries are going to be adopting. And the good news is there's a lot of sort of alignment. The GHG protocol is the kind of preeminent standard in each one of these reporting regimes. So whether it's California or other countries globally or the EU. So we've got this mandatory scopes 1, 2, and 3, the use of a GHG protocol. There is a little bit more flexibility in some of these other regimes around other standards, but all of this is, if you report to that, you're going to be, that's the gold standard. You can just sort of like press send on your report in between these entities. So I think we've got an exciting new environment, and I'm already seeing just a lot of changes, and just the amount of everybody getting down to business now that there's some, when you're not sure a law is going to be in place, you kind of hedge a little bit. But once it's in place and you're going to have to do it, I'm hearing such great stories from inside corporations of people really all coming together to get this done.
Catherine and I were talking before this episode around how she's headed out to Dubai for COP28 in a couple of weeks. And I am certain that this is going to be a topic of conversation as some of these global standards start to converge. I'm interested to hear how that actually emerges, and how some of these some of the voluntary mess that's been out there up until this point starts to be a little bit more simplified and actualized, similar to general accepted accounting principles, the GAAP standard that we have on the financial side here in the US, the IFRS that I referenced earlier over in Europe and elsewhere, et cetera.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think going to COP, I mean, as you know, we're at this point where we've got to make progress more quickly. We've got a public that is increasingly sort of questioning whether commitments that are made by companies, but also countries, are something that they can depend on. This is the first year of what's called the global stock take. So under the Paris Agreement in 2015, there was put in place a every 5 years, a kind of look at what progress has been made, and a sort of an accounting for those nationally determined contributions in total. And of course, this is the first year we're going to have that global stock take sort of what we know, and certainly as we know from reading the papers, and that we are really behind in getting where we need to. So I think there's going to be a sense of urgency. And as I said, just interestingly, the global stock take's all about GHG data. Like, what's the data telling us? We can make pledges, and we can, sort of opine about what we need to do. But at the end of the day, like, what's the data telling us? So I'm really looking forward to being part of that broader conversation. And I feel like California's new laws and these others, international movements are really kind of that recognition that we have to get serious. And I think corporations are really going to, I see them, playing a leading role and recognizing if they're going to say that they're on the right side of kind of climate history, that they're going to have to be really serious about that work. And that's a good thing.
SB 253 is still very new. I think it was just signed back in October, as I alluded to in my intro. And when Governor Newsom signed it, certainly there was a lot of celebration in the climate community about trying to get this type of disclosure out there. But there was also a little bit of reservation, especially from the California Chamber of Commerce and some other corporations that were a little uncertain as to what exactly this impact was going to be to them. Even Governor Newsom, when he signed it, indicated that there was going to need to be some, and I'll quote, cleaning up of the bill. Can we discuss some of that and some of the pushback that you've gotten on the legislation, and what exactly Governor Newsom may have meant when he said cleaning up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me just start by saying, as when things actually happen, when a bill of that kind of importance ends up getting signed, it's easy to forget how hard it was to get there. And there was
Senator Wiener tried to introduce this 3 times in a row before you actually had some success. So it definitely takes years for this to come across.
It does, and the business opposition, and I would say I would distinguish between individual corporations and sort of some of the traditional, and I'm going to call them somewhat legacy business lobby, like the chambers of commerce, the manufacturers. Like there was tremendous sort of business lobby opposition to this bill. More than $30 million was spent opposing this and some of the other climate related bills. So I think what we're seeing here, which I think is important to recognize, is that I see leading corporations realizing that they cannot let the sort of backward looking, right, sort of a business lobby, which doesn't really realize that the climate economy is absolutely, where sustainable business development happens, where those trillions of dollars get unlocked. Like, this is a tremendous opportunity to move us into that next part of the economy. So they were really kind of pulling back on that. And it was great to see these corporations kind of split from the chamber and say, we're not going to let you define our stance on climate. And so, but there was a lot of opposition. Yeah, I see you.
No. So tell me more about some of the corporations that did split from, like, the Chamber of Commerce. I'm aware of some of the large tech companies such as Apple and Google or such that came out in support of the SB 253. Why did they support something like this?
I think for many of those corporations, this leading corporations, they have been doing that hard work internally for a while. So, it's sort of like they've been the good students, right? I mean, they've been rolling up their sleeves and doing their homework and getting their GHG emissions house in order. And I think that it actually was them realizing they needed to be leaders in their global corporate community to say, like, that is actually something that we all need to do. And so I think it just that to me was, they're recognizing that we absolutely need to do this for the planet. And I think realizing that corporate emissions reductions weren't happening at the speed that was necessary. And so moving from being just good standard bearers for the climate to being corporate stewards, I saw happening during the time of this bill.
Mm-hmm. Is there any concern that we have around Governor Newsom's comments around cleaning it up?
I actually Governor Newsom is an amazing leader, right? And he does he comes out there and does what's important and what's also not always like without its detractors when he knows it's the right thing to do. So I think that I'm really confident that we're gonna, we've got a great bill, and he was very supportive of the need to be a climate leader and disclosure. There may be some small tweaks around the edges that need to be considered, but really, I'm not really seeing that comment about cleanup legislation as being some sort of incursion on the core policy. I think it's a big bill. We need to figure out some of those little things around the edges. So I'm not concerned about that.
With SB 253, and we talked a little bit about the SEC's upcoming guidance and regulations around that. The SEC rulemaking has really slowed down because of some threat of action, some legal action against them. I'm assuming with a bill of this size, with SB 253, you're probably anticipating certain action against that as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and how the reaction has been so far?
Yes, and I mean, as an attorney, I'm the first to say like lawsuits will happen. So I'm not Pollyanna about that, but I think that it's really important also to understand kind of the unique opportunity California has, given sort of the legal landscape. What happens in at the federal level, as you know, with the SEC rule, and I'm not at all saying I think these are good arguments, but I think that those that don't want to see a strong climate risk rule, at the federal level, are questioning the authority that the SEC has under its statutory mandate to promulgate this kind of regulation. So many attorneys generals have already said they're going to file suit, and they're going to say this is an unlawful delegation of authority, that the SEC doesn't have the ability to make this kind of rule. And so, at the federal level, and we have a court makeup that is, very dynamic right now. So that is going to be something to contend with at the federal level. When it comes to California, the beauty of SB 253 is it's a law that's been passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor, right? So there is no agency deciding if it can impose a requirement from a disclosure. This is a California law. And so we're in a much stronger position there. And there are potentially, legal challenges around commerce and regulating commerce, but this is getting a little bit into the weeds. But the importance of this law is that California is also treating companies outside of California the same way it's treating in-state California companies, right? It's an even playing field, and you can choose to do business in California and disclose, or not do business in California and not disclose. So we're feeling confident about our ability to withstand a legal challenge. And obviously we've got an AG in California, Rob Bonta, who's extremely climate forward. And, I think they're going to be a really strong defender of the law.
And to your point, it's fundamentally SB 253 is a disclosure law. You're not actually asking corporations to change anything. But I would imagine that's part of the hope that as they report on this, they're going to take action as well.
A really good point. Yes, exactly. And I mean, I think from the beginning, the fact that this doesn't require a change in business practice, it only requires a disclosure of data, is a really important distinction. Both in terms of kind of like where we are in the trajectory of this of this kind of work to decarbonize corporate America, but also because of the potential for legal challenges for something that would be a regulation. So I do think that at the same time, I think I'm confident that disclosure is going to lead to action, and that we don't have to regulate corporations, that when they have to disclose their entire carbon footprint, for many of them, the majority of their carbon emissions have not been disclosed up to now. We're going to see a very, sort of a new emphasis on decarbonization and being a good corporate citizen. So we don't need to regulate, I think, to make some real changes and to help corporate America move along.
Yeah, a couple of episodes ago, I interviewed the chief sustainability officer at Oatly. And one of the things she talked about was the fact that they're actually putting their carbon footprint for each product onto the labeling of the package. And she said it's very similar to the calorie counters that we see and we take for granted on many of the food products that we purchase already. When you disclose, when it becomes that type of transparency, and it becomes commonplace to be able to make decisions using that as part of the decision-making process. That's in a certain sense, I'm putting words in your mouth, okay? And frankly, I'm making a not so subtle, indication that the audience should go back and listen to Ashley's conversation as well. But that type of disclosure, certainly creates that transparency, so people can make better decisions around the types of companies that they're either working for, or investing in, or purchasing services from.
No, exactly. I mean, I think one of the hallmarks of the California bill was the SEC, kind of lens is for the shareholder. Like, what would a shareholder expect to know? And in California, it's really about investors and shareholders, but also fundamentally about consumers and giving consumers good information to make decisions about. And I think, as you said, just this idea of socializing carbon data as something that's just going to be ubiquitous in our lives, and it's going to help us make choices as consumers, help us understand our own behavior changes that are required. I mean, that's the other thing. I'm not a person who thinks it's only about the corporations. They need to do all the work. Like, we've all, government needs to do its work. Individuals need to do our work. And so I think this is just part of a whole ecosystem of, like, we've all got to feel a little uncomfortable because, like, we need to get some things done.
So we're coming towards the tail end of the interview, and I appreciate all this. I only have a few more questions to ask. One of which is, as much as we focused on SB 253 and all the amazing impact this legislation is going to have, California has been out in front around climate legislation for a while, and SB 253 is not the only thing that they're discussing there. There's also SB 261. There's AB 1305. I was hoping you could touch on those two bills as well. Maybe a very quick indication as to what those do. Even though I know you personally weren't necessarily connected to them, I feel like if we're gonna color the entire landscape of what's happening in California and the leadership that they're taking, we may as well touch on SB 261 and AB 1305.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it was a banner year for California and climate disclosure. And so, as you said, I mean, SB 253 was about corporate GHG emissions disclosure. SB 261 is similar in structure, in that if you're a company that does business in California, and for this one, the threshold is $500 million in revenue versus $1 billion. So it's going to capture more companies.
After a few more, yeah.
Public or private.
I personally am not quite there yet, but that's okay.
Exactly. I'm not sure if I'd be doing this podcast if I was, but yeah. So it was for them. For those companies, they also have to look at their climate risk, and so the recognition that climate change is also affecting companies and their ability over time to be sustainable and profitable. So looking at this broader lens of how is climate affecting a company's sort of current and future work is what SB 261 is about. And that AB 1305 is one that really kind of flew under the radar. And it requires disclosure by those who sell or purchase carbon credits. And as we know, carbon credits are a way of creating a monetary value for what would be called an avoided amount of carbon emissions. So we're especially seeing this in the net zero conversation, where if you decarbonize at a certain point, you're still going to have some carbon emissions. And so you may need to purchase the avoided emissions of another actor in order to be net zero. Or you might be a consumer that just wants to support that kind of decarbonization effort. So those carbon credits have come under a lot of scrutiny for not being something that is very reliable. And there's been so the importance of now saying, if you're going to have sell or buy a credit, you need to disclose the information about that credit so that we can have confidence in that market. So those three bills together, really, I think, are a major contribution to global disclosure requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could not agree more in the fact that the carbon market right now is going through its own, teenagehood of trying to identify exactly what it's going to be when it grows up. But Catherine, as we wrap up, what are some of the takeaways that you want the audience to take away from here? We've gone deep into some of the legislation, we've gone deep into some of the accounting nuances and such. But if anybody's to take away one or two key points and key bullets, what do you want the audience to take away?
I think for those in the audience that are in the corporate sector, I think this is a really exciting time to be, thinking and making a difference around climate. And I think that that's up and down, the personnel supply chain, right? I think C-suite's going to be much more connected to the sustainability folks and to operations and finance. I think that there's going to be a level of kind of collaboration, which is going to be exciting and powerful. And I think everybody in these companies is also going to have an opportunity to really be part of the solution. So I think it's an exciting time for those that are inside that corporate family. I also think it's a really exciting time for consumers. I think that having more data and being more empowered is really important. And I think not only to make decisions, but also because I think that there's a real concern, or that I have, about people feeling disempowered, about people feeling like they know that there's a big problem out there and they don't know how to make a difference. So one is, I think this law will allow people to have more data and be able to take action based on it. But up-leveling it a little bit, I also think it's kind of, I told the story about how this law came to be, and it's also to say that wherever we are, if it's in your neighborhood, in the city, the county, the state, then there's lots of ways for us to kind of go out of our comfort zone, see a gap, and try to do something about it. And so I hope that this story also gives people that sense that they too can make a difference. And that, if you kind of decide to put down your marker and work on it, it might take a little while, and you might have to make some new friends, but that there's an opportunity to be part of the solution.
A wonderful way to sign off. Catherine Atkin, thank you for joining us today on 8 Minutes for the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul.